Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Here. Thanks for coming this Saturday to our Housing Element Community Workshop. It's the second one that we've had this year. Just a few things before we get started. We have a sign-in sheet at the front, if you don't mind signing in. We also have a packet for this morning. It has an agenda with some handouts attached to it. I also made some copies of the draft housing element available, 4 copies. They can be circulated. I think there's one more at the table, and then I'll hand this one off as well. If you wouldn't mind sharing with your neighbors as we have this workshop here. And with that, we have the city's, I'm Lily Shinsing, by the way, administrative analyst in the administration department. And then we have the city's housing consultants here today, Karen Warner from Karen Warner and Associates. We have Jeff Bradley from Metropolitan Planning Group. We have Blaze Saika from Metropolitan Planning Group, and Justin Shu from M Group as well. I'd like to recognize that we do have Mayor Withy with us today, and we have Vice Mayor Tom Theodoris. That's all the elected, I see. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jeff.
Thanks, Lily. We have to use the microphones to make sure we get it recorded properly. Thank you all for coming and spending a portion of your Saturday with us. I know there's probably about 10 other things you would like to do as well today, so we'll try to get you out of here as efficiently as possible. We do have a presentation for you this morning, excuse me. I usually do these at night. The first thing, I just want to quickly go over the agenda so you can see what you're in for. We're going to explain the purpose of the meeting today. This is a community meeting. My daughter calls it a community forum because that's what they call them on Parks and Recreation, and so she thinks they're just hilarious. So you guys got to live up to it. Give me some quotes I can bring back. We're going to give you an overview of the project. The project being updating the city's housing element. We're going to give you some context in terms of where we are in the process, where we've been, where we're standing right now, and what the steps look like going forward. We're going to do a quick summary of our needs assessment summary analysis, which is a very technical portion of the housing element which seeks to describe the housing situation within the community. And we're going to do an overview of the policy and program summary, which is really the meat of the housing element. It sets out the vision and the intent of the community in terms of what it wants to accomplish in the arena of housing over the next 8 years. We'll talk about next steps. We'll have a Q&A, of course, some of which we've done in the beginning. Jan was nice enough to give us a heads up, some of her questions. So in terms of the purpose of the meeting, who here is this their first housing element related meeting?
No.
No one? Oh,
How long have we been doing this?
We've been doing this for a few years. We have one in the back. Okay, so just quickly, it sounds like we have some veterans here of the process. Just quickly, the housing element is a requirement of the general plan. It is a state requirement. Every city and county in California has to have one by state law. Not everyone likes that. People are talking about changing that, but those are the laws we live in now. I just got a speeding ticket coming through San Francisco. I didn't like that, but I can't change it. The goal is to maintain local control. The logic there is if we do this, if we comply with state law, then we maintain local control. Cities that don't do this find themselves in a challenging situation relative to maintaining state control. We can talk about that a little more later. We'll give you an update on our progress. We have a draft of the element that the subcommittee has been looking at. We're working on edits to that based on their feedback. The previous element from 2009 to 2014 was adopted back in 2012. And it looks like this, very lovely cover of the depicting the community. It was late in the process. You'll notice the planning period went to 2014. This was due back in 2009. So the city got it done, but they got it done a little bit late. So that's why it may appear we're now rushing into the next cycle. In fact, now we're just getting on a normal track and doing the housing element for the next cycle on the normal timeline. the city made huge progress in implementing a lot of the ordinances and programs within the existing element, which now allows us to properly update for the next cycle. In terms of the timeline, we've divided into 2 tracks to try to make it easier to follow the action. Track 1 was all the zoning ordinance amendments the city needed to complete before they could even really think about doing the new housing element. So as you recall, there was a lot of meetings upstairs to try to get those ordinances adopted. And that included the density bonus ordinance, reasonable accommodation, mixed-use ordinance amendments to facilitate mixed-use development. So a lot of that happened April, May, over the summer, culminating in July 22nd. Can we go back to that last slide for a second, please? So that was track 1. Track 2 is what we're on now. Now that all the ordinance amendments are completed and some minor revisions to the existing element were adopted and approved by the city and certified by our friends up in Sacramento, we can now move to track 2. So here we are at the second community workshop. We have several more housing community meetings and council meetings leading up to a 60-day review period with HCD, which is Housing and Community Development. We'll try to not use all the acronyms and speak things out properly so you know what we're talking about. If we do slip into acronym mode, please look on the back of your agenda. I think it's the green paper, or is it the yellow sheet? It's the yellow sheet. That's a lifesaver for these meetings. Even if you've been to a dozen of these meetings, I still find myself looking up some of these acronyms. So in terms of the context, can everyone see? I feel like I'm blocking. So sometimes we get so focused on housing element requirements, we forget that the housing element is simply part of the city's general plan. And the city's general plan is really the city's guiding document for how it deals with growth, development, traffic, open space, allocation of resources. And there's 7 elements or chapters of the general plan. There's land use, circulation, open space, safety, conservation, noise, and housing. So all these 7 elements fit together and they have to be internally consistent. In terms of the housing element itself, there's really 5 major components. There's a review of the past performance of the element, which we have now in the draft. We have the housing needs assessment, which we'll talk about. We have the evaluation of constraints to housing. And obviously in a community like Sausalito, there are a lot of constraints to housing. And we have accepted those, and we have formed our policy response in response to those constraints. And I think we can all think of what some of those constraints are. Small lots, steep hillsides, proximity to water, wildlife. And then there's also governmental restraints, fees, setbacks, development regulations, things that make it hard or difficult to develop new sources of housing for a community. We also have an identification of residential sites, which we have a map we can show you, but our strategy has been to dig deep within the city's existing zoning and general plan program and work with the existing regulations to tease out any development potential that is latently existing in the community as it exists. And that's really been our strategy for over about 24 elements we've done in this cycle and the last cycle. And finally, you must have a program strategy to address the needs you find based on the analysis. Cities can be on an 8-year cycle if they meet these criteria. Otherwise, they're subject to a 4-year cycle. Obviously, the city would like to do an 8-year cycle. You only have to do this in 2023 and instead of having to do it simply 4 years from now. And there would be a review by a state housing Housing and Community Development, HCD, for compliance with state law. So you'll hear a lot about the RHNA, pronounced RHNA, properly spoken as Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So that's a process where the state of California comes up with a really big number of about 1 million new housing units during the planning period. That is then doled out to all the metropolitan areas. In ABAG, in the Bay Area, we have ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments. They received about 200,000 of those, so about a fifth of the count of the statewide total. That's then split down to the county level and then down to the city level. We'll get more into the numbers later, but that's the conceptual framework. And there's a complicated formula for how each city and county gets their allocation, but the basic concept is a concept of fair share. That every city, every county in the state should share in the burden, if it's considered a burden, or the opportunity, if it's considered an opportunity, of providing the housing that the state needs from a statewide level. And at a high level, it's based on state population growth. There's a built-in factor of housing for different income levels, and the affordability is linked to zoning and density, which we can talk about when we get into a little more. And finally, this is probably the most important point down here at the bottom. We put it at the bottom because it's most important. Probably should be at the top. The RHNA is a planning target. It's not a building quota. You'll hear a lot of people, speaking about it as a quota. That Sacramento says we have to build, 800 new houses. Or that's not an accurate example for here. Sacramento's making Sausalito build 79 new houses, which is our RHNA number, 79. That's not true. The state law requires the city to show that you have the capacity to build 79. To approve, cities don't build housing, to approve 79 units of housing over the planning period. So that comes back to the general plan, what are the allowed densities, comes back to the zoning, how many lots, how many units can you build on a parcel of land. The follow-on question that comes up a lot is, well, if our community doesn't want to do this or can't do this for some reason, what are the consequences? And we've identified really what we see as the four main risks of non-compliance with the state housing laws as things exist today. And the first risk and the most common is housing element litigation. And this is simply when the city gets legally challenged or sued by some outside party. It could be a for-profit developer who finds that the city doesn't have a housing element. Maybe their project got denied, and they challenge it on that basis. It could be a nonprofit developer who's trying to provide affordable housing. They find the city doesn't have a plan for affordable housing, so they can sue. When Jerry Brown was Attorney General, he sued a couple cities over their housing planning, or lack thereof, which can lead to risk number 2, which is loss of local control. So if you don't have the housing element, which is part of your general plan, which is the foundation for your planning, then the judicial system can nick away and take away from things that the city can do using their usual discretionary powers, such as approving or denying projects, issuing or denying building permits. All of that activity rests on the assumption of a valid general plan. The RHNA becomes cumulative. Sausalito experienced this, not the previous cycle, but the one before that, we didn't have an adopted housing element. So in the 2009 to 2014 housing element, this one, we not only had to show capacity for the 2009-2014 time period, we had to go back to the time period before that and show capacity for all those units, which was over 300. So by doing it on the statutory cycles and deadlines, you're able to deal with the cycles discreetly and on their own, and they don't pile up on you. And risk number 4, quite simply, if you don't have a certified housing element, cities are ineligible for a lot of the grants that are floating around out there from both the state and the regional granting authorities, such as MTC, ABAG, Caltrans, a lot of different granting agencies. So in terms of the context, let me catch up with my notes here. So at this point, as we talked about, this element has been adopted. Many of the ordinances that were called for were adopted or modified. And those include the density bonus ordinance, the package of ordinances that allows the city to approve accessory dwelling units or second units that you'll hear a lot about. Zoning for emergency shelters was a state requirement. Some new changes to the mixed-use regulations to facilitate new mixed-use development, which we call vertical mixed-use, or you might hear it referred to as VMU. We used to have a program on HMU, which is horizontal mixed-use, but due to consistent community feedback, the city eliminated that program, revised the housing element, sent it back to Sacramento, they recertified it, and sent it back to us. So this process, you can see from that experience, is a real process. The city listens to the community and makes adjustments based on the feedback we get. And finally, the city also adopted what's known as a reasonable accommodation ordinance, which was also a state law. And it's really just common sense. If someone has a medical condition, permanent physical or mental disability, they require some reasonable accommodation from a city ordinance or rule. The city's able to grant that without a whole lot of red tape. So all that progress allows us to start now talking about the next element. We do have a draft available. The goal of this new draft is really to have minimal changes, because we just went through this. We had all the huge number of meetings with the public, the subcommittee, the task force. People have been working on this for years. We don't want to reinvent the wheel here. What we have, we feel, is still solid. So the goal is to have minimal changes and just change those things we need to change to comply with any new regulations or requirements to update numbers and things like that. And we literally have just one new program, which Karen will talk about. Okay, touched on this a little bit already. The existing element had over 45, nearly 50 meetings, community meetings like this, subcommittee and task force meetings upstairs, planning commission, council meetings, received a lot of input. Based on that input, the one takeaway as a consultant was we need a low impact strategy. Can't come in here and rezone 6 sites for 12 units each. That's not going to work. We have to get into the nitty gritty and come up with policies that aren't going to create a bunch of upset. And it's really a 3-legged stool. It's liveaboards, people that are living on the boats in the marinas. They've been out there for a long time. Some legal, some in a gray zone, but getting policies and programs that get our arms around those, and for really the first time in California, counting those towards a housing element. Pretty innovative program. ADUs, another acronym, accessory dwelling unit, second unit, in-law unit. The existing general plan before the recent housing element changed it, basically outlawed granny units. There was pages and pages about why you couldn't build a granny unit or an ADU in Sausalito. But the community sought that as a low-impact strategy. The Planning Commission Council and the task force recognized it as a good strategy. And it's also actually a state requirement that cities allow granny units. So all those forces combined, where Sausalito is now out there approving quite a few ADUs, so that can become a significant source of affordable housing. And finally, our infill strategy, which, as I mentioned, digs deep into the existing zoning structure of the city and teases out units that could be built on existing parcels under the existing zoning. So that document was adopted in October of 2012. We did a focused update and readoption in July of this year, the major change being to drop the HMU program and add a site at Ebtide that has existing zoning that allowed for 21 units that made up the difference for the change in the HMU. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen Warner. And what we'd like to do, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask us, and Justin will write them down on the sheet, and we'll make sure we answer them at the end. But I want to get through the presentation for anyone who can't stay for the whole time. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, my question would be, who would be monitoring the ADU rentals in terms of the cost? Because you said affordable rentals, and they're not affordable.
ADUs occupy the space within housing policy where they are considered by default to be affordable. Some will be rented for $0, right, to household help or relatives or different situations. Some will be rented for extremely high market rate prices for a very nice deluxe unit with an ocean view and everything in between. And periodically the city will have to do some type of data collection to get actual data on where all those units are falling out. But the starting point is they're assumed to be affordable. Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to answer that question. Justin, did you get that question written down?
Yeah.
Okay. So any more questions? I promise not to answer it.
Yes. Excuse me. Who are the members of the Housing Element Committee? Who are the members of the Housing Element Committee?
Okay, so currently we have the Housing Element Subcommittee. It used to be called a task force, now it's a subcommittee. We have Ray Withy, our mayor. There he goes. Tom Theodoris, our vice mayor. Yes. And we have, I wasn't supposed to answer that one either. Gosh, dang it. Susan Cleveland Knowles, our planning commissioner, and Joan Cox, our PC chair, right? Yeah. Okay, no more questions. Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. I have to give you the detailed answer on the ADU affordability. The city did a survey prior to adopting its accessory dwelling unit regulations and had 108 respondents of people that had basically illegal ADUs because they didn't used to be permitted. And we obtained rental information, and based on the rent levels, 15% of them fell within moderate income, 57% within low income, and 28% within very low income. So we were able to use that assumed rental affordability on future ADUs. So that's when we look at, counting them towards the RHNA, we use that distribution. But Jeff's right, in the future that's something that the city will want to do periodically is a survey to see what they're being rented at, because you're right, it can be quite expensive.
They are.
Right. Okay, so very focused update now on this housing element that is the 2015 to 2023 element for an 8-year period. Really, the only changes are to reflect the ordinances that the city has just adopted, to reflect the new RHNA, which has gone down to 79, to add one new program that we'll talk about, and then to eliminate a couple programs that have been completed. So it's if you look at the draft element, as it stands now, we're redlining everything, so you can see, the focused changes that are being proposed. And it has all the same components: the housing needs assessment, the evaluation of sites to address the RHNA, the evaluation of constraints, the identification of sites, and then your implementation strategy. Because this is a focused update, and because the city has adopted all the ordinance requirements of its last element, Sausalito's element is eligible for what's called a streamlined review through the state, so that they only focus on reviewing the changes. So they're only going to be looking at the red line changes, and everything else, all the good work that the city has done is, remains intact, and the state doesn't, reevaluate anything else. So to just highlight kind of each chapter and what has been changed, the introduction, only very minor changes. The housing plan, which is all the policies and the programs, as I said, it's just remove the programs that have been implemented and targeted updates. So for instance, we discussed the success of the city's ADU program. During the amnesty period, for 18 months, the city approved 14 previously unpermitted ADUs. Now they've been brought into the housing stock. The city approved 6 new ADUs during the last housing element cycle since adoption of the ordinance. So that sort of thing. The housing needs summary has been updated to reflect the new RENA. Housing resources has been updated to reflect the elimination of HMU and the addition of the Eptide site. And I think you can see it's just very, very focused updates. Keep going.
Sorry, can you go
Yes,
back 2
sure.
slides?
This one?
I'm looking at appendix C, underutilized. Okay, sorry, so you have taken view off, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt.
And I should have pointed that out. That was a recommendation by the Housing Subcommittee at our meeting a week or so ago.
Yeah, I saw that, and then
Okay.
the next slide too.
Under Appendix G, same thing.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So the needs assessment summary. This is just to kind of put in context why we have the programs that we do, to kind of remind everyone of what the key needs are in Sausalito. Very limited growth over the past decade. You actually saw a decrease in population of 4%. The aging population, median age of 51.1. And I was just curious because, Marin is obviously aging too, but Sausalito is aging more than Marin. Countywide, the median age increased to 44.5. So you're about 5 years average older than the county. Single-person households continue to make up almost half of the city's households. In comparison, in the county, only 28% of households have one person. And then you have few families with children, 10%, and the county's has 28%. So that's quite a big difference. So these sort of trends support smaller units close to transit, accessory dwelling units, senior housing, and then opportunities for families to be able to live in the community. Sausalito has some very specific groups that need housing support and assistance. Seniors probably being the largest of those. A quarter of your households are senior citizen households. A quarter of those are renters, so it's not all people in their homes. 40% of your senior homeowners live alone. So, and that's what our new program is trying to get at there. 70% of your senior renters live alone, and a third of your seniors are lower income. Very much related to a senior population as large as Sausalito is a fairly significant disabled population. 16% of the persons identified as having one or more disabilities, and nearly 40% of those are lower income.
Were all those statistics you just showed pulled off of the Census Bureau or what?
Yes, those are from the 2010 census.
Okay.
And so they're all detailed in the needs assessment and the housing element. We're trying to talk about marine workers as the other very significant needs group in the community. I'll just talk from my notes here.
Talk about it.
Sure.
You can also mention, everyone has a copy of the PowerPoint that you,
Okay.
if they want to follow along.
Okay, yes, there is a copy of the PowerPoint if you're interested in following along. So the Marine workers are, a big part of Sausalito's community and of Sausalito's lower income community. Similar to the survey of persons with accessory dwelling units, the city did a survey of occupants in the marinas, and the median income of those occupants was $42,000, which is very low. And many of these individuals couldn't live in Sausalito unless they were living on the water. The average berth rent at the time of the survey a couple years back was $660 a month, and you compare that with the average rent for one-bedroom apartment of $2,400 a month. I mean, you can see there's a huge disparity. Here you go. So, I mean, you've got all kinds of people that live on the water. A lot of them are involved in boat repair, and very involved in waterfront occupations. Liveaboards provide affordable housing options, especially for those that work in the marinas near their work. And we did, a lot of work to be able to convince the state that this was a permanent form of housing. And as you're probably aware, that BCDC, the Bay Conservation
Development Commission.
They're like the Coastal Commission for the Bay, provides permits for liveaboards, and the marinas are permitted to have up to 10% liveaboards per marina. So we worked extensively with BCDC in documenting the number of permitted liveaboards in Sausalito's marinas, and so 5 of your 8 marinas have BCDC permits for liveaboards. And then we looked to see how many were actually occupied in those marinas, and so that we were able to calculate where there's additional capacity. We were able to look at where the census didn't count liveaboards, where we knew they existed. So all of this enabled us to credit liveaboards in your adopted element. And then for the future element, we're looking at one of the marinas, Sausalito Yacht Harbor, that's only using 5% of the capacity, where they can go up to 10%. We're looking at that increase as part of your future arena.
How many people are living as marine workers? Do you know? Or the percentage of the population?
I'll have to look that up. We have some estimates. Yeah, several hundred.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's enough.
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of some of the special needs populations in Sausalito: seniors, persons with disabilities, persons that live on the water, the desire to get housing so families can move into town. And so some of that, putting it in context, is just looking at what the costs are. So the median sales price in last year in Sausalito was $895,000. The price per square foot, at over $700 a square foot, was one of the highest in the county. The rental costs, as I mentioned, one bedroom average rents are $2,400, so very, very high.
But those are last year's numbers, right?
Yes, so that's the rental costs are it was March, there was a rent survey done. But the reason we wanted to look at an entire year worth of sales, and then we look at the affordability and
I just
what
wondered
have
about
you.
the rents, how old, because they keep.
I know, right, so that was from March, that survey. Next slide. And then when we talk about income categories, and you hear, very low income and low income, we try to kind of correlate that with occupations that make those levels. So a very low income household in Marin County, and this is 2013 because we wanted to compare that with the sales, earns $45,000. And as I mentioned, the median income of the liveaboard was just right at that, so they're basically very low income. And a nursing assistant is an example of an occupation that makes in the very low income category. Low income is up to $72,000, and that's an elementary school teacher in Marin. Moderate income is up to $99,000, and that's a firefighter in Marin. And then above moderate income is over $98,000. So when we look at affordability, we took the Marin County elementary school teacher salary of $66,000. So this is low income. The ratio of not spending more than 30% of your income on rent. Okay, I just want to point. And so that allows that teacher to spend $1,665 a month in housing costs. That's the maximum affordable. You look at that in comparison to what a one-bedroom rents for in Sausalito of $2,400 plus a utility allowance, you get $2,500. So $2,500, but that school teacher can afford $1,665. There's an affordability gap of $835 a month. So that you really begin to see, why your workforce can't afford to live in the community where they work. When we look at a similar thing for home ownership, and clearly with home ownership, you're going to have, this is the median price in 2013. You're going to have condos, that are lower than this, but this just highlights the gap through the $895,000 median home price. The moderate income four-person household earns $123,000, and the maximum that household could afford is $566,000, which is a lot, and that would be a gap of $329,000. And now I'm going to turn it back to Jeff to talk about RENA.
Thank you, Karen. So we touched on this a little earlier, but this just so you can get your head around it, in comparison between the two cycles. So this is split down the middle here. This is the old cycle, and then this is the new cycle that we're embarking on. And essentially, due to the recession, there was a big adjustment downward. You can see it went from 215,000 to 188,000 for the Bay Area, where historically these numbers had just gone up, 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 up. So this was a sort of a correction. And then Marin County kind of benefited from that. The number for Marin County went from almost 5,000 to well under 2,500. So it went about half, or less than half of what they had before. And so Sausalito is sort of benefiting from that, because our RENA went from 165 to 79. So all the hard work that the city did to accommodate the 165 last time can simply be rolled over and counted twice, counted again. The best way to think of it is if you had a vacant piece of property that was available for development during the prior time period, and you look out your window and it's still available, there's nothing built on it, then it could be counted again. If something was built on it, you could count it as progress towards your old cycle, but you couldn't count it as inventory for your new cycle. So Karen touched on the income groups, and then this is how that corresponds to the RENA, because that housing allocation is also broken down by income category into the very low, the moderate, and the above moderate. So you can see you have a pretty good distribution. It's not heavily weighted toward one income group over the other here in Sausalito. So in terms of that three-legged stool I talked about as our strategy, our low-impact strategy, we've been struggling with how to communicate that effectively, because if you get into lots of numbers and details and policies and programs and maps, it can get a little muddied. But try to come up with this slide to very clearly show how this all shakes out. So you can see nearly 3/4 of the units of our strategy are coming from the infill strategy, which is that process of looking at the city's existing zoning, existing parcels, and saying what could reasonably be built on those parcels in the future. And so that's 179 units. The liveaboards and the ADUs combined make up the other quarter of the strategy. 31 liveaboards, as Karen talked about, and because we have a longer planning period to look at, and now we have a track record of how many ADUs are coming into the city, we can reasonably say over 8 years, 5 per year, 5 times 8 is 40. That's our estimation going forward. And then this is a map that shows how, by looking at literally every parcel in the city and seeing where the potential is, it winds up being scattered all over from way up here on the top to down by closer to the water and everything in between. You'll notice we removed the Butte Street site. It simply wasn't needed. It's owned half by the city, half by an individual. There's talk of making it open space, so let's just take it off. We did add the Edgewood, Ebb Tide site as part of the changes to do away with the HMU in the Spring Valley neighborhood. So that it's a little tricky because I want to say that's not a new site for this element, because it's not. It's in your adopted housing element, but it still kind of feels like a new site because it came in, just at the tail end of the process this summer when we revised the existing element. And this is where I hand it back to Karen.
Okay, I'm going to just touch on, again, just focusing on changes. We have great programs in your element, but I'm only really going to highlight anything that's been changed from what's been adopted. Program 8, the mixed-use zoning. So previously we had Program 8A that was vertical mixed use and 8B that was horizontal mixed use. No more horizontal mixed use. We have a mixed-use zoning program. That's all the city's existing regulations to allow for upper floor residential within certain commercial districts, along with the recently adopted vertical mixed-use regulations to require an affordable component for those, basically one affordable unit for residential projects in commercial districts with 6 or fewer units. A project with 7 or more units would require 20% affordable units. So it's a way of getting some affordability within the commercial districts. The accessory dwelling units reflects the adoption of the ADU ordinance, and there's a goal for 16 new ADUs. So Jeff mentioned 40. That 40 is actually broken down into new and amnesty. We have a lot of amnesty units that filed applications that were still being processed after the amnesty period deadline in March. So some of those will come to fruition. There's, as part of the ADU program, in the draft element update, there's a proposal to have another amnesty program because there was such an overwhelming response in the first amnesty program, and the city knows there's more out there. So there's a goal to have 24 more amnesty ADUs. So that contributes 40 ADUs to that 3-legged stool, which is very significant. And the only reason we're able to do that, and again, we haven't set the element up to the state yet, but is because the city has such a strong track record. The new program, the teaser that we keep mentioning, is referred to as junior accessory dwelling units. So this is a concept that's been floating around Marin County. The city of Novato, San Rafael, and Marin County are actually moving forward on ordinances. So what a junior ADU, or some of them refer to it as a junior second unit, is within an existing single-family home, and picture it being occupied by a senior citizen and not using a lot of the space in a single-family home. Would be carving out an unused portion of that home, a bedroom or a den, and creating an independent rental unit with its own bathroom, some sort of a kitchen, area, and that becomes a junior second unit. So you're not creating any additional space. You're not, adding on to the home in any way, but you're creating, an independent space within a single-family home that can be used as rental, perhaps for a caregiver, for a tenant, and to the extent that, and I think some of these other jurisdictions that are looking at adopting these ordinances, they are creating the ordinances in a way that these units would qualify towards their regional needs. And that requires the units to have a separate entryway, to have their own bathroom, to have, some sort of a kitchen facility. So Sausalito needs to evaluate this. They're not ready to jump in and say, this is exactly what we're going to do. So the program is to basically evaluate this as another housing option, and what type of standards the city would want. Would they require additional parking for this, or if it's really not creating any additional space, would they allow it to use existing parking? So it's to explore a junior second unit program. Liveaboards, we've talked about this. So the program moving forward, the second bullet point, which is what I was talking about that counts towards your arena, is this idea that Sausalito Yacht Harbor is only using 5% of its 10% capacity. So the program is to work with them to get both a local conditional use permit and the BCDC permit to utilize the full 10%, and then they could count 31 additional liveaboard units. The other first bullet point, though, deals with both Sausalito Yacht and Pelican Harbor have their BCDC permits. They don't have local city permits for the liveaboard component. They have a lot of different permits, but not for the liveaboard component. So it's to, bring them into the city's official housing stock and get their local permits. And then the bottom bullet point there is just an indication that the prior program, the multifamily development in multifamily districts, which was a new zoning that encourages multifamily zone properties to utilize the property more for the density that it's zoned for. That's been adopted, so that program's eliminated from the element. And then the prior program 21, which was a special needs zoning, which incorporates zoning for supportive and transitional housing, emergency shelters, that's been adopted, so that is no longer needed in the updated element. Program 20, the density bonus ordinance that was just adopted, now is reflected and reflects the city's creation of 2 tiers in the density bonus ordinance, and the tier 1 being those sort of incentives that the city prefers an applicant would choose, and that would require only planning commission review. Tier 2 being the less preferred incentives, because they're incentives that would likely have a greater neighborhood impact, such as a height increase. Those are, would require both planning commission and city council review. So that is all reflected now in the element. Sausalito Senior Services, there is a new age-friendly task force that now is reflected, and their plan of action. So that's all discussed in this program. And then the reasonable accommodation program that Jeff mentioned is addressed. The housing for marine workers, this program has been in there, but now we have language that discusses establishing procedures and working with the marina operators for the low and moderate income occupancy requirements, which is something that's in the city's code, but there's not really an implementation piece to that. I'll turn it back to Jeff.
Thank you, Karen. We're almost there, 2 more slides. Next steps, get your feedback today at this community meeting. You can tell us now, you can email us, you can call us. There is a subcommittee meeting Monday morning at 8:30. If you want to come to that. And then this next council meeting is tentatively, hasn't been nailed down yet, but it's either going to be September 30th or October 7th. We have October 7th on the slide, but we're still looking at both of those dates. And once we get council authorization, we would then ship it off to HCD in Sacramento for the 60-day review. They have 60 days to do it, but they've been doing these a lot quicker, we found, in this cycle. And finally, Lily's contact information is up here for any phone calls or emails to staff. And then also at the bottom, there's you can follow on the city's website. All the information gets posted on that and is available all the time. And with that, we'd be happy to take your questions and try to get them answered. Yes, Jill.
So, Jeff, I have lots of questions. Sorry, I have lots of questions, and I don't think, it seems like if you're not planning any more workshops and you're just planning to approve this plan, but I have lots of questions. I think there's still a little bit of work to be done, maybe a lot, I don't know. My first question is about the VMU, and I'm looking at the numbers, and I know that there's some issues about the total numbers. It looks to me like we're planning for 250 total units, although only 79 are required. I'm looking at a very low income of 26 and 14, which equals 40. And then I look down at our strategy, which is liveaboards of 31 and ADUs of 40, which together, equals 71. So 71. So I'm looking at liveaboards and ADUs of total in our strategy that equals 71, but a requirement from RENA for very low and low of a total of 40. So it seems to me that we have that covered. We should have that covered. We should have very low and low income covered with the liveaboards and the ADUs total, and that we have our strategy includes 250 total units. So I'm not sure why we need the VMU. I haven't had anybody articulate why, and I did watch the subcommittee meeting the other night, and you guys were discussing the VMU. And Karen, I saw that you told the members of the subcommittee that the VMU, and I may have this wrong, and obviously you guys are the experts, but that the VMU was the only method by which you could get multifamily and family and multi-household numbers in the low and very low. And that's why we still needed the VMU, and I may have misunderstood that, but I can tell you where the site was in the tape if we need to go back and look at it. But I remember when we talked with Melinda Coy, when she came down from the state last spring, that we talked about that very issue about whether or not the affordability was tied to the size of the unit. And her response was no. And so that's why it seems to me that we've met our very low, we're able to meet our very low and low with the liveaboards and the ADUs. And the other thing too is that, I saw where in the tape from last week that liveaboards don't count as family units. And that was a question I had too, because I know lots of families who live on boats, especially at Galilee Harbor and at other. So I don't know why, if it comes down to that we do need a very low family unit, that a liveaboard wouldn't count for that. So those are some of my initial comments. The junior ADUs also, I think, are worth looking at. I think that's a great idea, and I know that comes out of an idea of senior housing and allowing seniors to age in place. And so I think that's a very, very interesting idea, and the thought is that a senior lives in a large house and that they're carving out a small section of their large house for their junior ADU. And therefore the parking is not an issue because they live in a large house that's already got the parking. So, and then the fourth thing that I wanted to talk about was the January 31st deadline. And I did see in the housing, the subcommittee tape where we're concerned that we won't be eligible for streamlining if we don't hit that January, and that's why we're pushing for the January 31st. And there's also, because there's an ability to, there's like a grace period, 120-day grace period. So I don't think that we should rush and push to that January 31st if we still have sort of these issues that we're still trying to work out with regard to the housing element plan. And so that's, I guess I would like, some confirmation from the state about the consequences of not meeting that January 31st deadline. Because I think that's a big issue, and it seems like we're rushing through this track when we spent a lot of time last spring on getting the first one right. And so, anyway, those are my comments. Sorry.
2 minutes.
Let me start backwards with the deadline, and there is a 120-day grace period. And I worked in the Southern California region before the ABAG region, and many of my clients use the 120-day grace period. You will not be eligible for streamlining. So that opens up the city's element through the state looking at everything over again. That's not a position to take lightly, because you could have a new reviewer, and there's a real benefit to just having the state look at the changes. It doesn't mean that you have to have your element adopted by January 31st. We have to have for eligibility for streamlining, we have to have your element up to the state in advance of that. Theoretically, at least 60 days in advance. I'm not sure how flexible the state would be on that to still have your streamlining ability. If when it comes back from the state, as long as you adopt within that 120-day grace period, which would put you at May 31st, you still have eligibility for the 8-year cycle. If you extend beyond that 120 days, and I had clients adopting the night of the 128th day, then you go to the 4-year. So that's definitely need to get your draft to the state well before January 31st, but the adoption has a little more flexibility, if that helps answer that. On the VMU, and we were asked to, look at, is there the ability to remove the VMU? And as you recall, the VMU is essentially encouraging second-story residential in the commercial districts, not the CN2, but the other ones. And doesn't increase height, doesn't change the standards or anything, and has that affordability component. So we looked at the statutes, and are there certain statutes that VMU is meeting that other parts of your housing program aren't fulfilling? And I think that's what you're referring to in the subcommittee meeting. So there's one of the housing element statutes that requires cities to have programs to facilitate the construction, so we're talking new construction, of affordable housing. This is really the only program the city has, because you have a program to evaluate inclusionary zoning, but that's not in place. You have state density bonus law, but that's state law. You have, your ADU program and your liveaboard program, but that's not necessarily, deed restricted affordable. So this is really your program. It's kind of a form of inclusionary because you are requiring, any new residential development in these commercial districts to have at least one affordable unit. The family issue, so that's that one part of the statute. And then when you're talking about, Jill, the RENA and whether the family units need to be for very low and low, The VMU does require the affordable unit that's provided to be at least 2 bedrooms. So that is helping to meet that family need. ADUs, liveaboards are smaller. They aren't really, they could theoretically be family, but by their nature, they're not really considered meeting the family need. The VMU addresses the need to provide rental housing, and it addresses the requirement to demonstrate that there's specific sites in the city that can accommodate such housing. So that's kind of the pieces of the statutes that the VMU addresses. Was there some, am I missing anything else?
Liveaboards is family units. What, you just said that.
Yeah, I mean, I
Just
think,
talk to that.
I mean, we keep coming back to this whole issue of affordable family units, and the push for the VMU is this affordable family unit. But there's no requirement that the family number or the multi, be affordable. And so the other 220 numbers meets that family and affordability. So, you're trying to use the VMU for something, for a requirement that's not there. I mean, that's the way it seems to me, and I think that's correct.
And I think maybe what I should do is, I kind of put this memo together that identifies the statutes and how the VMU addresses each of those statutes, and maybe, getting you a copy of that would help clarify that.
Maybe, but I mean, I think we asked a direct question to Melinda Coy last spring, and the answer was no. There's no requirement for the low income part is not directly tied to family. And so that seems to be the driver for the VMU, and
I think the number one issue out of all these statutory requirements, that the VMU is the only program that addresses the requirement to have a program that facilitates the development of affordable housing. So if you take VMU away, you're not meeting that statutory requirement.
Right.
Okay, so that has nothing to do with family.
Right.
Okay? That you can argue about whether liveaboards are providing a family component or not, but I think that in itself is the requirement for the VMU. You need to find something else that addresses that requirement.
Okay, and I'm looking through the site list down here, and some of these sites are, well, we can talk about this later, but I mean, anyway. Sorry, so overall, we're fine on the numbers. It's just the construction of new affordable units is what we're talking about, and that's what the VMU hits.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's different than what you stated, so, thanks.
Anyone else have a question for the group?
You had said that 5 of our 8 marinas have liveaboards. Why not?
BCDC permits.
Yeah, why aren't the other 3 marinas getting BCDC permits? Are required to do so?
I can't really answer that question. We were dealing in the world of, the legally permitted liveaboards as something that we would be able to count, and working with making sure they were counted. The ones that don't have the BCDC permits, that's kind of a whole nother gray area. That's kind of outside the purview of the housing element. Maybe as part of the general plan update, the city can look at, are these marinas something that should be brought into the fold and brought up to code, and,
Potential for next time.
Probably, yeah.
Well, there are significant requirements on a marina to allow liveaboards that include expensive infrastructure requirements. And so not every marina wants to undertake that expense.
Which ones don't have it?
Which do we know which ones don't have them, Lily? Of the 8? Or Karen?
I know the ones that do have.
We could figure that out and get back to you on that one, Jim. Any other questions before we wrap it up? Yes, Nancy.
I'm not quite sure how to, first of all, my voice is almost gone. But the scariest thing about this whole thing to me has been what they had more emphasis on previously was the ability to create affordable housing overlay zones. Now, I assume that that still is intact. And actually, I've heard from my husband who talked to a council member who said, don't worry about any of this. None of it's going to be built. I assume he meant our planning commission has a way of keeping these things if, you know, it's because it says this is, you don't have to build these. This is what you need to show that they're there. However, most of these vertical, the ones that fall within the vertical designation, to me, seem to fall in these small commercial places, which tend to be here at the north end of town. I think of, for instance, over Kitty's, over Sausalito, where Sausalito Travel was, now it's not, over the Chinese restaurant. And yet, if you say, oh, it'll never be built, does that mean that those, or wherever, can those affordable housing overlay zones be adopted in some way and bypass, as I understand it, our entire planning commission, that they pretty much can set all new rules and there's no way that our existing structure can fight them? I'm not sure I had asked that right, but maybe you get the point.
I think that's a good question, Nancy, because when we first started back in 2011, the plan of action on the table was to identify maybe 10 or 12 fairly decent sized sites, not huge, but bigger by Sausalito standards, and do a affordable housing overlay zone, the AHOZ strategy, another acronym. And each one of those sites was generating intense community opposition all around it. And so our strategy was just the opposite, was to dig into the city's existing zoning system and come up with our sites inventory. And I put this slide together to kind of help dispel that fear factor. Because 179 units sounds like a lot, right? Why do we have a sites inventory of 179 if our mean is only 79, right? Plus we have the ADUs and we have the liveaboards. But 87% of these sites are only supporting 1 or 2 units. 5% of the sites support 3 or 4 units. And 7 of the sites support 5 or more. So this is really a fine-grained approach to just literally teasing out any little tiny incremental development potential that's out there. And no one can put an overlay zone on a property except the city council. And there is not a single, in this whole new draft document, there's not a single mention of a affordable housing overlay zone. So it's not part of the city's plan for the future to do that strategy.
I never knew where the control came from, so it comes from the city council to create the overlay zone.
Right, absolutely. Yes, Jen?
I've got 2 more. In your inventory list, and I asked this before but didn't get an answer, you stated that sites that had been redeveloped since 1980 were eliminated. But I know of one site that was totally rebuilt since 2005, and it's on the list. So is there a way to get that off the list? And then the second question is, you know, there's the Valhalla development that's going on and has got community support. But there's been some kind of emotional statements that I'll just not develop it and then sell it once it's zoned if I don't get what I want. So my concern is Planning Commission approved it, it's a great plan. But if it goes to the city council and gets approved, if that is sold, can that then become a high density overlay development or not?
To answer your first question, we can definitely update the inventory based on updated information. And the second question, I have not been following that project closely, and I would leave it to Lily probably to take a stab at that one.
That's something probably Jan,
Or I can address that.
yeah, maybe Joan can, or we can talk with Jeremy, because I haven't been following along all that so much as well.
That site is subject to the Fair Traffic Initiative, which prevents any density development exceeding 0.50. So even the overlay, the planned development that is now proposed for that site, although it's being converted back to R3, it will be a planned development site so that the density can never exceed 0.5, and it will never be able to be developed as high density like its surrounding neighborhood. That site was initially zoned high density, and Sally Stanford, our former mayor, was successful in getting it rezoned to commercial. Now that it's being rezoned back to its initial zoning, because it's subject to the Fair Traffic Initiative, even though it will be R3, the zoning designation will be 0.50 instead of 0.80.
Thanks, Jen. Anyone else? All right.
I'll say item. Instead of questions, I just want to make a suggestion, is that maybe you should be open to welcome more HUD badge recipients, and to open the idea for monolithic housing or comp housing, and miniature cottages, I guess, basically. Thank you.
Any more questions or feedback on what you heard today? Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Again, our next meeting with the subcommittee is Monday at 8:30, and then council meeting on the 30th or the 7th.